Hello everyone. This video is part 6 in my series Hope of the Gentiles. Now, assuming you watched my last video, part 5, this one's a direct continuation of that, where I will be wrapping up discussing the Native Americans and why many of them did not accept the gospel and Jesus, etc. Now, I'm going to keep this introduction very short. If you haven't watched the last video, watch that one before you watch this one. But with that being said, let's jump right into it. Now, in my last video, we left off where I was talking about how the European Christians were making it very difficult for Native Americans in terms of converting. And I also talked about how it seemed as though the Europeans were more concerned with making the Native Americans like themselves than actually simply preaching Jesus and the gospel to them so that they could receive their salvation. In many ways, the Europeans were very arrogant, and they were relying more on their own understanding and on man's wisdom than the wisdom and understanding that comes from God. This is in complete contrast to how the Apostle Paul went and preached to the Gentiles, where this is what he says in the first book of Corinthians, chapter 2, 1 through 5. So, when I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on man's wisdom, but on God's power. And so you see, Paul did not go among the unbelievers in arrogance or with a superiority complex, as he himself claims. He went to them in humility. Paul was an Israelite, but he did not try to make the unbelievers Israelites. Or the Gentiles Israelites, same thing, like he himself was. And he did not boast about how superior his knowledge was to theirs or about how superior his race was to theirs. Although he certainly could have if he wanted to, because after all, he was an Israelite, which are God's people, God's chosen people. However, he did none of these things. His goal was simply to preach Jesus and the gospel so that they could be saved. When the Europeans came to the Americas, they took one look at the Native Americans and concluded that everything about them, pretty much, was, and all that they did was barbaric and needed to be destroyed, or at least many Europeans did that. Not saying all of them did. They did not hesitate to heap insults and slanders on the natives, and this too is also in complete contrast to the Apostle Paul's conduct among the unbelievers. In the book of Acts, when Paul first went to Athens and was instructed to wait for some of the other apostles named Silas and Timothy to join him there, while he was waiting, he was disturbed by the abundance of idols that were all over the city of Athens, as it says in Acts 17, verse 16. Paul witnessed this and probably saw many other pagan customs practiced in that city. But later, when he went to the Areopagus in that same city to preach, he did not begin by ridiculing or slandering the Athenians. Instead, this is what he says in Acts chapter 17, verse 22. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious." So you see, Paul began praising the Athenians for their religious devotion, even if it was misguided, because such devotion can also be applied to the worship of the one true God. And many of them were worshiping the one true God as the unknown God. Their knowledge about him was incomplete, if that makes sense. Now, all this was Paul's attitude and conduct, not just to the Athenians, but all the Gentiles he went and preached to. But do you think that if Paul had the same attitude towards the Gentiles that the European Christians had towards the Native Americans, do you really think anyone would have converted? I guarantee you no one would have converted. If anything, Paul would have been executed, and Christians would forever be looked down upon. I mean, there would literally not be a house they could enter they would not be kicked out of. The knowledge of Jesus and the gospel never would have spread. The only reason the Europeans weren't kicked out of the Americas was, obviously because the natives, by the natives was because they were weaker and, they were more powerful. But if they were more evenly matched, judge for yourselves. Do you think the natives would have tolerated the Europeans' attitudes and unbiblically strict legalism? Doubtful. Now, a lot of times, even when many of the Native Americans did convert to Christianity and submitted to the demands of the Europeans, they would still be persecuted, and many of the European Christians themselves still hated them, usually for racist reasons. Instead of recognizing them as brothers and sisters in Christ, as the Bible preaches, they still only saw them as their enemies. In 1675, war broke out between the English and a confederation of Native American tribes in New England. This conflict came to be known as King Philip's War. Now, during this time, the praying Indians in the praying towns that were established by people like John Eliot, which I discussed in my last video a bit. Many of these Christian Indians were incarcerated by the English despite being neutral during the conflict and, of course, being Christian. Usually for suspicion, or from suspicious reasons. Anyway, during the following winter, after when the war began, many of these natives that were locked up lacked food and shelter, and many of them died. And even after the war concluded, many of these Christian natives came back and found that the praying towns that they once resided in were either destroyed or had been sold, like someone else bought them, or both. And then another incident that took place in 1782 occurred when the Pennsylvania militia marched into the town called Gnadenhutten that housed a small community of natives of the Delaware tribe. The natives in this town were Christians of the Moravian denomination and were also pacifists. They had been living in peace with their neighbors prior to this event, which would be remembered as the Gnadenhutten massacre. Basically, the militia just rounded up all the natives, butchered and killed them, all men, women, and children, and also raped many of the women. It's claimed that many of them were singing Christian hymns as they were about to die. And once again, these natives were not recognized as brothers and sisters in Christ, but as enemies. This event shows a lot of reminiscence, I must say, also to the Christians of the early church, like many of the apostles, many of whom were martyred for their faith. I mean, it's very reminiscent of that. It's sick. Anyway, lastly, this next incident is probably the most sickening I have personally come across. This incident occurred in 1864. It would go on to be known as the Sand Creek Massacre. I personally learned about this event when visiting the History Colorado Center when I was on a trip in Denver, Colorado, earlier this year. This massacre involved the Arapaho and the Cheyenne Native American tribes, and took place, of course, in the state of Colorado. Prior to this event, there were many tensions and small conflicts between the natives and U.S. settlers who were moving into the state more and more, usually over land disputes, which usually the settlers were the aggressors. And this was also during, like all the gold rushes and stuff. By the way, just mention that. Anyway, eventually, chiefs from the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes tried to make peace with the U.S., and one such chief, named Black Kettle, wrote a letter to a man named John Evans, who was the territorial governor of Colorado, literally asking him, how could peace be achieved? And so this led to a meeting between the Arapaho and the Cheyenne Indian chiefs and Governor John Evans, along with Colonel John Chivington, at a military outpost in Denver called Camp Weld. There, the Indian chiefs were told that if they and their people moved to a place called Big Sandy Creek, there would be peace and they would also be protected by U.S. soldiers. But just a few months later, regiments of U.S. troops came, massacred all the natives that were assembled in Big Sandy Creek, and witnesses say that many of the natives were mutilated, burned to death, and many also had their scalps and other body parts cut off. Many of the soldiers literally took these as war trophies and then proceeded to parade them around when they went back to Denver, in the city of Denver. And if that wasn't bad enough, the media in Denver published articles further dehumanizing the natives as savages, further fueling more conflicts and hatred towards the natives. And they also portrayed the massacre that took place as some great battle and heroic victory on the part of U.S. soldiers. And they cast the blame for the massacre on the natives themselves. Surviving witnesses say that there was even a white flag symbolizing surrender in the Native American camp during that massacre, but that, of course, did nothing to halt the massacre. But what's truly sickening about this event is that those involved purposely deceived the natives. They literally set them up to be slaughtered. And the man who led the massacre, Colonel John Chivington, who was a colonel, he was also a Methodist pastor. He was a Methodist pastor. And Chivington was also not quiet about his views of the natives, for he was recorded saying this about them before the massacre happened. "Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians, and I believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little, nits, make lice." I don't know about that. I don't know what that last part means. All I have to say, it's disgusting that such a man who massacred a bunch of helpless people and speaks such vile words was the pastor of a church. When I read about this at the museum, I'm be honest, I was a little sick to my stomach. Like, I don't know how such a person can think that God is on their side when this is their conduct and mindset. Like, you have to be crazy to think that God is on your side. The Bible tells us what the church ought to do with people like this, though, in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1 through 3. "It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that does not occur even among pagans. A man has his father's wife. And you are proud. Shouldn't you rather have been filled with grief and have put out of your fellowship the man who did this? Even though I am not physically present, I am with you in spirit. And I have already passed judgment on the one who did this, just as if I were present." And then a few verses later, Paul gives this command in verses 11 through 12. "But now I am writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who calls himself a brother, but is sexually immoral, greedy, an idolater, or a slanderer, a drunkard, or a swindler. With such a man do not even eat. What business of mine is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked man from among you." And so what the Bible is basically saying here is that it is the job of those in the church to also judge those in the church. These verses command us to expel the wicked from among us, to keep wickedness and corruption from taking root in the church, and also to preserve the reputation of Christ and the church itself. Because the church is supposed to be a lamp of the world. That's what the Bible calls a church, a lamp of the world, a lamp in the darkness, a light in the darkness, for the unbelievers to bring them to salvation. But, see, people like John Chivington, who likes to brag about butchering, people made in the image of God, are nothing more than a blight and a stain on both Christ and the church. And people like this, I really don't. I'm just going to be quite blank with you all. People like this have no place in the church, unless they repent and reform themselves. I mean, no place. Like, in no way, shape, or form can people like this be tolerated in the church. These are the people we have to look out for. Now, besides him, let's also not forget the Bible talks about not associating with people who call themselves Christians, but are also slanderers and drunkards, and the other examples for the verses I read to you. Now, notice how this only applies to believers who do this thing. In verse 10 of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul makes clear that we can still, to an extent, associate with unbelievers who do these things, so long as their practices don't lead us astray. Because how else will the unbelievers come to a saving knowledge of Jesus unless we associate with them and get a chance to talk with them? So, of course we have to associate with them. But, when believers are doing this, that's a different story. Another thing I want to make clear is that there are also many people in the world who you might call drunkards or addicts. Many of these people are addicted, but they also recognize how wrong it is, and they're trying to break those addictions. And people like this we shouldn't avoid. Rather, we should help and encourage them. And as I've said in my previous videos, there's a difference between those stumbling and living in sin. Those who are trying to break off addictions are stumbling, and they need help. So don't avoid a brother or sister in need. Now, after everything we've discussed through this and the last video, let me reiterate again that I'm not trying to demonize Europeans and the colonists that came to the Americas. There were many good Christians who came over who, in contrast to many others who lived hypocritically, not even trying to embody or follow the teachings and commands of Jesus and the gospel which they claimed to believe in and follow, there were many good Christians that strived to live out their faith and share that faith to the Native Americans. They could complete the knowledge of the natives who still clung to God, who many of them worshipped as the Great Spirit or Great Mystery. The knowledge of the Great Mystery was, I like to think of it like this. The knowledge of the Great Mystery was like a foundation of a building unfinished, figuratively speaking, but then completed through the knowledge of Jesus Christ, the revealer of the said mystery. Nevertheless, because many of the actions and attitudes of the Europeans and colonists towards the natives, they pushed many of them away from accepting Jesus. One example of this was from a Native American tribe who said this to a Swedish missionary who was trying to convert them. If the Christians live better than we according to their religion, then we would become Christians. But we cannot find that they do, because we see and hear them drink, fight, whore, murder, steal, lie, cheat, etc. Such things we have never known. Thus we are better off as we are. Now, these words ought to strike our hearts with sorrow. Think of the Americas as if it were figuratively a house. For Christians, we can't expect to walk into someone's house, nitpick and ridicule the owners of that house, and the house itself in many cases, while we ourselves are also proclaiming a gospel or an idea or whatever else that many of us don't even try to follow, and expect those in the house to convert. And if this be the case, why should those in the house put up with us, or why should they care to listen to what we have to say when we have dishonored and shown them nothing but contempt to them? Why should they listen to us? So for any believer watching this video, we must learn from the mistakes of the past. We are not judges against unbelievers. We are not their masters. We are messengers proclaiming the truth that brings peace and salvation. When Christ first came into this world, he did not come to be served, but rather to serve, and we must do likewise. And there you have it. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I will see you all in the next one.